Good afternoon to you all. I want to welcome you in Delphi. After 2 difficult years of coronavirus, we are able again to meet here in beautiful Delphi. Welcome. The idea is for us to speak about Africa and about the challenges and the problems that Africa will face and how she can deal with that. I read recently that the idea that the 21st century would be the century of Africa was introduced in early 2000 by Thabo Mbeki, then president of South Africa. And I will ask you that question later on, if you believe that he was right, that 21st century, regarding the problems, it will be the century of Africa. So I want to welcome Executive Prime Minister of Ethiopia. He was in 2020-2018, Haile welcome. I want to welcome the Minister of Finance of Somaliland, Dr. Sakal Naleye, welcome. Former President of Mauritius, you were President of Mauritius in 2015-2018, Ameenah Gurib-Fakim, welcome. And Dr. Greg Mills, he's the director of the Brenthurst Foundation in South Africa. Welcome to you all. We are expecting to have a connection also with Vera. Songwe. She's the United Nations Under Secretary General and Executive Secretary of Economic Commission for Africa. She's not with us yet, but we expect her to make an introductory note. And so I want to begin with the lady that we have here with us today. Mrs. Fakim, I want for you to make an introductory note before we go on with the questions.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Moderator. I would just like to start, first of all, by thanking the Delphi Forum for inviting us and to having the possibility of having an Africa chapter in this very important session. So as we know, the African continent represents 20% of the Earth's surface. Unfortunately, it is not reflected in the Mercator maps. She's home to 1.3 billion people and targeting 2.5 by 2050. She's also home to 60% of the world's arable land, swathe of forest, 30% of world reserve of minerals, youngest population, yet she produces only 3% of global GDP, accounts for less than 3% of global trade, dominated by primary commodities and natural resources, carries 25% of the global disease burden, and accounts for only 2% of the world research output, 1.3% of research spending, and 0.1% of patents. How can a continent that has fueled all of the world industrial revolution, a continent that has helped drive the mobile phone industry and at the cusp of supporting the world's energy transition to greener technologies with a large store of rare earth minerals, deposit accept such dismal statistics? The deficit, I think, in investment in science, technology, the absence of economic and scientific infrastructure for innovation have undermined Africa's economic transformation, both at the structural and at the sectoral level. The consequences have been significant and include the continued reliance on the colonial development model of resource extraction, largely responsible for for the debilitating poverty and aid dependency trap. These challenges have also been compounded by economic fragmentation, with smaller markets constraining long-term investment and the injection of patient capital to foster innovation and drive technology transfer in the context of globalization. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which defragments Africa to establish the largest single market in the world by membership, has created the condition for scale, lifts one of the most important constraints and path of economic transformation. Meeting the challenges of economic transformation has eluded Africa for decades. Hopefully, the AFCFTA era will hinge on Africa closing its scientific, technological gap with the rest of the world and sustainably producing the right set of skills to address supply-side constraints and ultimately expand both extra and intra-Africa trade and sustain higher rates of growth and accelerate the process of global income convergence. Manufacturing is a major factor in helping Africa, and to reach its manufacturing and industrial potential, much needs to be done by the public and private sectors to increase Africa's economic complexity, diversity, competitiveness, and productivity. Africa's significant demographic asset may provide some answers. The World Bank estimates that 11 to 15% GDP growth over the next 20 years will be attributable to those fabled demographics, increasingly connected via the mobile phone. So the key question is, what are the policies, skills, and contours of the scientific ecosystem that will foster sustainable growth of scientific technological innovation and accelerate the process of economic transformation? We have to establish proof of principle that world-class Pan-African science and innovation can be mobilized for tackling Africa's deep and entrenched development challenges led by Africans in Africa, with priorities set by Africa for Africa, but in strong partnership with the international community. The way Africa can claim her rightful place as the global driver of prosperity for the benefit of all is when she'll have the best trained, best talented researchers gravitating around an environment where their work is leveraged by modern equipment, reliable utilities, sufficient funding for supplies, and more critically, benefiting from the presence of other talented people. And we must address Africa's brain drain. It can be transformed into Africa's brain gain, and creating research infrastructure. And of course, we know that for the broader context, the prosperity of the African continent lies at the intersection of nutrition, health, agriculture, environment, governance, and the economy. All this must be done so that the benefits of science, technology, and innovation have to be marshaled for the greater economic, social, and environmental sustainability, both for the continent and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Saad, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I'm going to talk about, again, opportunities and potential of Africa, rather than problems and challenges. Well, Africa has been known as the dark continent until recently, and that's because people knew very little about the continent. And I think that's still true to a certain extent. And I would like to introduce you to Africa in a certain way. Well, first, Africa is the second largest continent on the planet. Its area is more or less equal to the area of the United States, plus the area of China, plus the area of India, plus the area of Western Europe. All four combined is a huge continent. But it's also the second most populous continent, with a population of about 1.4 billion at the present time. And it's the continent with a large number of countries. The AU has 54 member countries, and all of them are members of the United Nations, which makes Africa a powerhouse politically in the international arena. Now it accounts, as has been said already, for about 1/3 of the mineral resources of the world. It also accounts for up to 40% of gold and 90% of platinum and chromium. So it's really a rich continent. But the economic and social indicators do not show that. If you look at, for example, the GDP per capita in Africa is about 1/5 of the global average. That's very low. If you look at, for example, life expectancy is about 64 on average, compared to 73 global. So Africa scores badly in these indices. For example, the Human Development Index, it scores 0.55, which is almost half of that of Norway, which is 0.95. So despite the assets and the richness and the wealth it has, that's not showing in terms of economic and social development. But things, I think, are changing. If we go to 2050, let us say, the African population will hit, that's 30 years from now, 2.5 million. It will double, more or less. And the GDP, the combined GDP of Africa will also grow to $15 to $20 trillion by 2050. And it's estimated that the middle class of Africa will be like 1.4 billion by 2050. And the millionaires from Africa will exceed 250,000, 250,000. Now combined then, that gives you a huge potential for consumption in the continent. And you may ask, what are the drivers of change? How is Africa going to go from where it is now to where it will be in 2050? And I think there are many drivers, but the first driver, of course, is the population growth. African population is growing at 2.45% per year, and that's because the combination of high fertility and lower mortality rates. Compare that to that of Europe, which is 0.01, or to that of the United States, which is 0.76, or even Asia, which is 0.83. They're all under 1. Of course, Africa will taper, the population growth will taper as well, but it will grow very fast up to 2050. Now, there's also the urbanization of Africa, which will be another driver. By 2050, up to 1.6 billion people, Africans, will be living in urban areas. And industrialization is also another driver. As the cost of labor in Asia, in China in particular, and India and the rest, goes up, industry will migrate to Africa, where the cost of labor is cheaper. And in fact, the African countries are preparing themselves for that eventuality. They are heavily investing in the development of special industrial zones, special economic zones, because that will happen. And instead of getting from Africa just raw material, you'll be getting manufactured goods 30 years from now. The higher demand for African natural resources will also bring more capital into the continent. But also commercialization and the agricultural biotechnological engineering revolution will make Africa the breadbasket of the world, rather the aid basket of the world as it is conceived today. Now, the digital revolution, that's a combination of e-commerce, e-communication, e-governance, e-learning, e-banking, will also revolutionize the economy in Africa. It's in fact already doing that. For example, Somaliland is a cashless society already. Within the Ministry of, for example, of Finance, we are trying to digitalize all the tax systems so that there will be no need for people to go out and collect taxes from businesses. Now, the accumulation of capital is another driving factor. Even though if you look at the budgets of the African governments, it may seem that not much importance is being given to education. Parents value education very much in Africa, and in fact invest heavily in the education of their children. And Africa is much more educated than it was 20, 30 years ago. For example, in my ministry, we have about 20 consultants provided by the World Bank to us. And about 80, 90% of these consultants are Africans, they're black Africans from Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and the rest of Africa. 20, 30 years ago, that would have been a different scenario. You would have all the consultants coming from Europe or America. Another driver is the diaspora. There are about 20 million African migrants in North America, in Europe, and the Middle East, and they remitted last year up to $47 billion. But they don't just bring money, they bring also ideas, and they bring, they bring to the continent know-how. The energy revolution is also another driver, because the continent is blessed with renewable sources of energy, with sun and wind, and it can create potentially up to 10 terawatts and can be a net exporter of renewable energy by 2050. Now, there's also capital accumulation happening in Africa. 25 years ago, there were just 5 capital markets in Africa, or stock exchanges. Today, there are 29 of them. Almost every country has a stock exchange. And the combined value of these markets is roughly exceeds $1.5 trillion. And last year, in 2021, African companies raised up to $47.5 billion from these capital markets. Another driver is the improved connectivity of the continent of Africa. Africa was disconnected in the past, but it's now being reconnected. And through the development and the investment in land and sea and air corridors, the African Development Bank is investing, for example, in 6 corridors and investing in roads up to 12,000 kilometers. But also, Ethiopian Airlines, for example, is connecting Africa. It serves 62 destinations and 40 countries. I mean, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, that didn't happen. Every African country was connected to its previous colonizer. But now Africa itself is being connected and interconnected, and that's really making a huge change. Of course, the speed and the direction of the change will be affected by enabling and disabling factors, and I think the international community has the responsibility to assist Africa, to continue in that development path. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Saad. And you put a lot of things on the table. And I will take that with Mr. Jim Nevels. I welcome you here in Delphi, Mr. Nevels. He's an American businessman. And we talked before we began here the official conversation. We had a talk outside, and you talked about diaspora, about African diaspora and how important it is. And I want you to take it from there, and we can listen to you.
Absolutely, and thank you very, very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I am the chairman of BCIU, the Business Council for International Understanding, and one of our primary purposes and missions is to bring business, bring thoughts to the discourse, to the international discourse through our membership. And I'm going to speak to you today about 2 of our members. One, a high-tech company, and the second, a venerable old American company. BCIU is about a number of things. Founded by Dwight David Eisenhower 66 years ago, we are about helping Africa's entrepreneurs through business partnerships. In addition to the point that has been raised earlier about the African diaspora, we are looking to leverage that opportunity. What fundamentally was a challenge to a group of people, including my ancestors, can now be leveraged into an opportunity. And then finally, and I think this is ultimately very important, countering the brain drain. And in effect, building intellectual infrastructure. One company, Flutterwave, Africa's fintech unicorn, providing the plumbing, the hardware for fintech so that other entrepreneurs coming to the continent will have the opportunity to be able to move money, to be able to gain information about their clientele, and to further build their businesses. Flutterwave is bringing the world to Africa and Africa to the world, and providing, in addition, companies like Uber and Netflix a single Pan-African payments platform. That is significant. And why is that significant? It levels the playing field, it enhances technology, and it affords and attracts and retains talent rather than having it leave. The second company that I will tell you about is one that's near and dear to my heart, and that's the Hershey Company. Located in Hershey, Pennsylvania, but sourcing its cocoa from Ghana. And if you've ever been to Ghana and been at Ameenah Castle, There was the exportation and the diaspora, but also the utilization of natural resources by a company, the Hershey company. And what did it commit to do? It committed 10 years ago, on my watch as chairman, to ban child labor. To ban child labor. And what's significant about that? Doing the right thing, doing it consistently, respecting the culture, respecting the children, because after all, for those of you who have not been to Hershey, there's a school there. It's a K-12 school. And at that school, thousands of children have been educated and moved on to great careers in life. You cannot exploit one group of children for the sake of benefiting others, and that's what Hershey did not do. And in fact, having those children educated and not chopping cocoa builds and adds to the continent, and that is essential. Those are the tale of two companies. One, a fintech unicorn, member of BCIU, that is doing great things, and that second company, a 170-year-old company that is making sure that children are educated so they have the opportunity to remain in their home countries and become productive citizens. That is the tale. That is the tale of two companies. And I want to thank Simeon for allowing us to be here, and absolutely grateful for the opportunity to share the stage with you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Mills, the floor is yours. There have been raised a lot of things about diaspora, about how rich continent Africa is, about the many young people that it has. Now there is also the war in Ukraine, and although Africa has so many things, so many good things, it has a lot of problems also, and it seems that there are difficulties in getting over these kinds of problems, and maybe also the war in Ukraine will not help Africa. It will create maybe more problems like it does for the whole world, not only for Africa.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me here and for having an Africa platform. I'll try and shake things up a little bit, if I may, not least since I was in Ukraine a couple of days ago, and have a fairly inside-out view of that particular conflict. Let me just remind you of four statistics that haven't been mentioned thus far, amongst many statistics that have been already. The first of these is that nearly 70% of Africans routinely polled across African countries by Afrobarometer prefer democracy to any other form of government. The second statistic is that 10% of Africans currently live in countries which are described by Freedom House as free. The remaining 90% live in countries which are unfree or partly free. So they have not realized their democratic preference. The third statistic is that Africa is going to be home by 2030, just around the corner, hopefully we'll all get to experience it, to 25% of the world's youth, those under the age of 25. This provides a tremendous opportunity if provided for, if we can cater for them in terms of education, in terms of the internationalization of the continent's economies. It's part of the 2.5 billion.
It's what what Europe hopes for. We want in the European Union to have young people, and our population is aging, and that's a huge problem for our future, and Africa has that.
Indeed, and about 500,000 of the annual 2.2 million people who seek asylum in the European Union every year come from Africa. It's quite a small percentage relative to the conditions in the continent, but it's another one worth considering in terms of what happens in the future in this context. And the fourth statistic I would remind you of, which hasn't been mentioned, is one which probably has the greatest development potential in the continent if properly harnessed. And that is, within this decade, the majority of Africans are going to live in urban environments. 100 years ago, that figure was just 10%. It will be over 50% in the next 10 years. That provides opportunities for economies of scale in rolling out infrastructure, in providing education and other basic services. And here are three very brief answers to some of the questions that have been posed and that you yourself have posed. The first of these answers is rather, maybe it sounds rather academic, but I think it's nonetheless important. And that is of the need to differentiate. Africa is very bad at differentiating because we always like to believe that we're all in the same boat. But in actual fact, the performance of African countries is radically different. And here we have two examples of radically different performance, of bottom-up organic systems of development and democracy and growth, which are actually not the African norm. This is the paradox. These are very successful precisely because they exhibit those tendencies. The solutions have to be highly differentiated, and the problems are highly differentiated. We tend to come with a templatic one-size. So when NEPAD, the New Partnership for Africa's Development, was created nearly 20 years ago by my boss, among others, Olusegun Obasanjo, the idea was if you provide more financing to Africa, Africa would get into a different development trajectory. Well, actually, financing's part of the problem. It's not the entire problem, and it's not the entire solution. And other single-issue explanations for Africa's development are equally misinformed. They tend to focus on one thing to the detriment of others. We also have to differentiate Africa by performance levels. So across the continent, Africa's democracies, that 10% of population that I referred to, routinely do much better at development. They deliver development over a longer time scale in a more consolidated and less volatile fashion, precisely because they have recourse to the rule of law and precisely because investors are more inclined thus to invest in diversified rather than commodity-based, single commodity-based extractive type investments. The second of my three answers, and I'll be quicker, is that the answer fundamentally lies in the political economy, and that, of course, is made up of many things. It is the reason why Africa, as the former president pointed out by her range of statistics, is relatively disadvantaged and poor, is because the way in which economic decisions are made reflect a series of elite or oligarchic-based interests. And that relates back to our political conditions by and large, is that there's very little that citizens can do to adjust these policies over the medium term. And this raises a third and final solution, as it were, and that is about the role of outsiders. Now, I would argue, as you've already heard me say, that the responsibility for Africa's development primarily lies with Africans, because, frankly, they're the ones who live there. They're the ones who have the tools at their disposal. But that doesn't mean that outsiders are not going to play a part in development. Debt is a particularly important aspect of the way in which we're going to develop. The record of managing debt has been very bad over the last 10 years. We've gone from roughly $300 billion of external debt in sub-Saharan Africa to over 700, with very little to show for it, because much of it has been wasted on excessive spending. And some of that is related to the way in which China, which is now the largest debt provider to Africa, has gone about its business. But using debt effectively is going to be a critical part of the African development success story. And here I would say the international community, particularly Western donors, and you're right to point out the possibility of the diversionary effect on Ukraine. I mean, the US has provided nearly $15 billion in emergency assistance over the last month. That money is going to come from somewhere, and it's probably going to come out of other aid disbursements. But I would argue that the way in which the international community, and particularly Western donors, can assist Africa to a greater extent than hitherto is by calibrating aid expenditure based on this political economy track record. To put it very bluntly, I would argue that given the record of democracies in delivering development to their people, they should be incentivized and not incentivized en masse throughout Africa. And it's beholden on donors to differentiate aid expenditure as much as anybody else analytically does in the continent.
Thank you, Dr. Mills. Now, Ms. Fakim, the issue of democracy that Dr. Mills put is something extremely difficult. How do you think that can be not solved? How can the other African countries differentiate and have democracies? I mean, we saw that the West managed many times to have even revolutions in countries. We saw what happened in the Middle East, and the issue of democracy is always something that we in the West, we ask for, but maybe the people, even if your statistics say that they want it, maybe they don't want it. I mean, we saw what happened with Iraq, we saw what happened in Afghanistan, and I am wondering, do the Africans want the change that could bring what Dr. Mills said with democracy?
That's a very interesting question. The very notion nowadays of whether democracy is the best form of government or governance is being questioned. And some countries, I mean, if you look at some intellectuals, they will even tell you that there is democracy even in countries like China. Now, what is the yardstick that we are going to use? Our form of democracy in Mauritius, when we actually became independent, is that we made choices. And we made choices for favoring institutions. We made choices also in terms of addressing some very significant issues, such as providing social safety nets. We made choices to provide free healthcare. Eventually, we made choices to provide for free education. And all these issues which were taken and which donors even said that the country is going to go bankrupt and the private sector was all up in arms against these decisions, finally reconciled with the fact that this was, of course, some of the prime elements which ensured our stable democracy as we emerged. And we actually, by investing in sound education, we are able to actually develop manufacturing sector, and now we're hoping to go towards much more innovative industries. But it's a choice that people made, and we have made that choice to be in that space, and we have made that choice to keep on nurturing the talent, even though now, because we are now victim of our own success, because now we are considered to be an aging country with about an average age of about 48, so we actually demarcate from the mainland continent, where the average age is beyond, well, in some countries, between 16 to 18 even. So I think it's only a question of choices we make, but I think fundamentally, we have to put people at the center of development. And this is what we did, because we're a country with no resources, contrary to many countries in Africa, which of course very rich in minerals and other resources. But our own focus was the people. And the people made the choices, and the people actually run the institution. And we try to stick as far as possible to all the best practices of governance so that we can ensure that democracy prevails, and we see what the future lies ahead of us.
Thank you. Dr. Saad, what do you think that is the biggest challenge now for Africa? Will it be a food crisis because of the war in Ukraine, because of Russia's war against Ukraine? You think it's going to be corruption? And I'm taking back what Dr. Mill said, because dictatorship, corruption, and all that creates huge problems for the African countries. What do you think that the next big challenge will be for Africa?
Well, Africa faces the same challenges as other countries in other continents. For example, the Ukraine war. That affects everybody. In Somaliland, we have 2 flour mills, and they used to get their grain from Ukraine. So we are affected. You know, the world is so interdependent and so interconnected nowadays that anything that happens somewhere touches upon everybody else around the world. We're also having the challenge of the COVID. The COVID hasn't gone away. It has gone away from the newscast, but it hasn't.
Because of the war.
Yeah, but it's still there. Yeah, but it's still there. The sanctions are also going to impact Africa, as well as other countries, as well as other countries in the world. The sanctions may be targeted or intended to deny Russia the ability to continue waging war against Ukraine. It has wider implications. And in fact, it's not the oligarchy and the presidents and the rich people who are affected. It's the poor people, who are affected. So that's another challenge. How do we navigate, the impact of these sanctions imposed on Russia and others?
And Russia has invested hugely in Africa, as China also. Is that correct? Yes. China and Russia have invested a lot in Africa. I mean, Russia is in Africa also.
Well, Russia is not maybe that much present. It used to be present during the liberation era in the 60s, but I think since the collapse of the Soviet Union, it has withdrawn from Africa. But China is replacing it. China is, investing in infrastructure capital in Africa from east to west, from north to south, Of course, China doesn't give money for free. There are no grants. It's a business, It lends money. And of course, all infrastructure around the world is built on debt.
It creates jobs for the African people or no?
Well, that's the issue.
Yes, I know, that's why I'm asking you.
Yeah, taking a loan is fine, because that's how you build or invest in infrastructure. The only issue with China is that they also bring the people who build the infrastructure. So that's the main thing. And then you will have to repay the debt, of course, after a while. But of course, on top of this international challenge, Africa has its own challenge. Climate change, for example, is one. That's a big problem. Now we are having a very severe drought in East Africa as a result of the climate change. It hasn't yet rained, and we are now in April. That's very unusual, And of course, conflicts. We have a lot of conflicts going in the continent, and that's a major problem. Ethiopia, which was really on an which was developing very fast until a few years ago, is now having problems because of internal conflict. So internal conflict really is also dragging the continent from emerging from poverty and growing economically. Of course, democracy, the issue of democracy, is democracy necessary for development or is it not? But if you look at the record of Africa, you will see countries which are democratic and have been very successful. Mauritius, for example, is a very successful country. Seychelles, Cape Verde, Botswana, they have been very successful democracies. In Namibia, very successful democracy. But at the same time, you have also countries which have been successful but not democracies. Rwanda is one of them, for example.
Successful for all the people or successful for the elites? I mean,
economically.
Ms. Fakim told us about social security, protecting people, free education.
Yes.
Do we see that in non-democratic African countries that are successful?
Yes, yes, we do.
And please feel free, whoever someone wants.
Yes.
I'm asking now.
Well, maybe not, entirely democratic, or maybe not entirely undemocratic. You may have somewhere in the middle, where you have strong leaders, and sometimes kings. Look at Morocco, for example. It's not a democratic country at all. Well, it has some democracy because they elect their parliament, but you have a king, who rules, who's an absolute monarch. And they have been doing very well. You look at Egypt, for example, with Sisi. He toppled a democratically elected government, but I think on record when it comes to economics, I think he's doing all right. And there are other countries as well. Yeah. And in Ethiopia, you had Meles Zenawi, who was a very strong leader, not exactly democratic, but he really changed that country. So there's a mixture of successful democracies and also successful non-democracies in Africa.
Mr. Nevels, would you agree with that?
A couple of reactions, and thank you.
Of course, yes.
A couple of reactions. Number one, if people are hungry, they can't learn. If they don't learn, they're destined to poverty. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. That's the case in the United States. It's the case in Ghana. It's the case in Côte d'Ivoire, which is why it became important to make sure that those kids in Hershey, Pennsylvania, that were getting everything that they could possibly want, educationally, in terms of sustenance, you have to do that at the root country. If you do not, hungry kids don't learn.
But how can you do it? How can you do it? The people that you educate in the United States, the Hershey people, young people, are they returning back to Africa, to their countries?
By making sure that those companies that are operating the Flutterwave, and others, it is in their best interest to have an educated populace that will attract and retain talent. That's what good business, good responsible business does. It delivers those intangible and tangible benefits. And to the extent that there is the support of education, elimination of food scarcity and being aware of it, because we have a situation here where we're going to have unrest in Africa because of the cost of food and the ability to not have that. And the consequences of that, and what we're really facing, is the diminution of talent on the continent if we don't address and deal with the food scarcity issue, which then leads us into the educational issue and the funding by entrepreneurs to retain.
I'll just quickly come onto this because, we're talking about democracy in Africa. Africa is 55 countries. And I think if we have to look at the history of Africa, we have to look at it for the past 60 years. Why I say 60 years? Because this was the time when many African countries were becoming independent. So self-determination, of course, can be flagged into the equation as far as this is concerned. Having said this, if you look at the progress of many African countries, if you look about 40 years ago, you'd find at the helm of many African countries army generals. And now we are seeing a new breed of technocrats, of lawyers, of different kind of mix of people who are at the helm of these countries. And we are seeing that the nexus between having this kind of leadership, although you can also argue that the leadership, of course, is very old in some countries, but generally you find that if you look at the nexus of leadership with what is happening in the country, you'll find that it makes a big difference to have this new breed of leaders who are coming in. But one thing that Nevels has said, rightly so, how do you address the food security issues? And we know that Africa is going to be very heavily impacted, and this is where I think when we talk about climate justice, this is a continent that has not actually contributed to greenhouse gas, and yet it is bearing the full brunt of climate injustice, because we have contributed less than 4% of greenhouse gas, and yet we are now seeing drought, we are seeing uneven rain pattern. Even my country, last week we had 400 millimeters of rain in 2 days.
Do you see a more closer cooperation with European Union, and Dr. Mills, feel free whenever you want also to intervene with European Union. We know that the European Union is trying, it has a difficult past, a colonial past with Africa, so Africans, they chose China, I think, over European Union, over European countries, and that's fine, that they were right, I believe. But now, do you think that a closer cooperation with European Union, and maybe European Union accepting more refugees, more migrants from African countries, and educating them, and these young people going back to Africa, or even with renewable energy and education, and whatever you think that the European could help, I mean, would be more productive, because obviously China is money-wise productive, but...
Countries don't develop on charity. They develop on the basis of investment. Just look at the figures. There's $1.6 trillion of FDI sloshing around the world every year. Africa gets around 50 billion of that. Most of that goes into commodity investments. Africa's aid tranche is considerably less than that figure now. It's not really where the money is. The money is in Africa getting a greater share, as the former president pointed out, of FDI flows, getting a greater share of all the helicopter money that has been printed over the last 12 years. That's where the answer lies in terms of solving the African development conundrum. I mean, we sit in sub-Saharan Africa with over 400 million hectares of arable land, of which a ridiculously small percentage is farmed commercially. Why? Well, the answer is because of an absence of mechanization. That relates to an absence of title, to subsistence farming methods. The yields are very poor. The yields are barely subsistence in terms of their outputs. And that's why we are dependent on the Ukraines and Russias of this world. On to the point that you asked the finance minister about, 1 out of every 3 loaves of bread in Eastern and Northern Africa comes from Ukrainian grain. So there is going to be a tremendous shortage about to occur, not because the Ukrainians don't have the grain to sell, it's because they have no means of exporting it fundamentally, given that they're exporting about 10% of what they usually do. But we do have in store the ability to produce for ourselves. It's actually creating those conditions by ensuring that investors are sufficiently attractive. It doesn't have to be foreign investors, it can be African investors, and that you can commercialize this on a scale.
Why doesn't it happen? Is it corruption? Is it politicians that are bad, are very bad for their own countries? Why hasn't that happened?
Well, you asked the question about democracy. The issue is, it's not that you can eat democracy. That's clearly not the case. It's that the alternative in Africa has proven even worse, by and large. And there's,
in my opinion, in the whole world.
There's exceptionalism. So we roll out the Rwandas and the Ethiopias of this world, which are very poor by continental averages. Rwanda's half as rich as the average African country. Ethiopia, a third as wealthy as the average African country, and declining because of its current conflict. So there are exceptional cases, but generally across the piece, the more democratic, the better governed, and the more likely you are to attract these sorts of diversified investments. And that is what we as Africans have to be aiming for. That is our trajectory towards progress.
We have been talking about refugees, and we have also been talking about the young population coming out of Africa. And we have seen quite a few people dying in the Mediterranean. And I think it's because we talk about European Union, we talk about China. I think it's in the interest of European Union countries to invest in Africa, because this way you prevent the flow of migrants going, and of course we know that the issue that have been happening in Europe because of the migration issue, and this is a problem for EU as well. And now if you posit this model to what China has done, where China has invested quite a bit in the surrounding countries, be it Vietnam, be it all these countries, and I think it's in a way, partly the purpose of sharing that prosperity that stabilizes the region as well. So if you want to stabilize Africa, as has been said rightly so, we don't want aid, we want more trade, and we want more investment. And to get that investment, and we take, for example, just one sector has been rightly addressed, agriculture. 85% of agriculture in Africa is still rain-fed. Yet we are going to have climate change impacting that. So what kind of investment are we going to put in a sector which is going to weigh more than $1 trillion as we speak? And that's agriculture, only one sector.
We need a hand up, not a hand out.
When you talk about that with politicians, with the countries in the European Union, with the United States, with the Western democratic world, what is the answer? Do they want only to give you, like you said, charity, money, or invest? Why is there a problem in real investment coming from European Union?
I mean, one of the challenges is we don't, unlike Asia, we don't have replicable success stories on scale across the continent. So if you look at what happened in Asia, you had Japan under the Meiji Restoration. Then after the Second World War, it got its act together and went from being an imperial industrial power to a consumer industrial power. That was replicated by the Tigers. The Tigers were replicated by others.
In Greece, after the Second World War, we had the Marshall Plan.
What we don't have is we haven't had an anchor tenant like Japan, then followed by a series of African lions, to coin a phrase, to be followed by the next ring. We haven't had those. We've got Mauritius, which is, with the greatest respect, in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and we have small countries which have been pockets of success, Ghana, Botswana, relatively small population numbers. Our big strategic clients, well, anchor states, Congo, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Sudan, South Africa, have been relatively poor performers. So the approach has been of regional insulation rather than integration. And we have to find a way to turn this on its head, to have the countries to replicate as success stories.
One way to proceed, sorry, just so quickly, one way to go about it as well, because we have so much resources, and one mention has been made about cocoa. 65% of the world cocoa come from two countries, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. I think it is time to rethink the tax system. When big corporates come and invest in Africa, we need to look at the way the commodities are being traded and the tax which should flow back to the continent. And Africa is at the cusp of now sponsoring and, of course, really rolling out the resources that will help this energy transition we're all talking about. And this rare earth metal, they all come from Africa. So how do we leverage the resources from Africa to work for Africa, of course, with partnership with the rest of the world? That's the question.
Dr. Saad.
Right. Well, as to the question of how Europe can help, I think at the present time, the relationship between Africa and Europe is defined by the importation of raw material from Africa, African migrants.
Yes, but they had the conference, and they're trying to re-establish a better and more productive relation with Africa.
Yes.
Well, that's how we journalists read that. I'm asking you.
Right. What I think is that we need to transit from the sort of relationship that we have at the present time, and perhaps, start a new page where the relationship is defined by fair trade, investment, transfer of technology, and I think that will be in the interest of the European Union and the Europeans as well. At the end of the day, Africa, I think, is the future. As the statistics we just mentioned said, 1 in 4 people of the globe by 2050 will be an African. And Africa has a huge potential. So I think what Europeans need is to realize that potential in Africa, not see us as a problem continent, but as a potential continent, as a continent of opportunities, and invest. I think we need not only the government, but also businesses. We need businesses to come to Africa and invest and take advantage of the opportunities.
Please, no more EU-Africa summits. They're an excuse for inaction. If you have a summit, you know nothing's going to happen.
Well, maybe with EU, it's a little more, it takes more time, but we manage it.
Let's go for more trade and less aid.
Okay. Mr. Neville, something, we are out of time, but you want to add something?
Well, again, thank you for assembling us, and I'm greatly appreciative of the opportunity, but I will take it back to that great fintech company that attracted investment and is one of the highest valued fintech companies. Retaining, attracting people, capital is efficient. 1, 2, decrease the exportation of talent. When you have a Flutterwave, a company like that, that is going to become as prominent as any fintech company in payment systems, that's the magic. That's how it happens. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming in Delphi and having this discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.